Greetings, all, and welcome to Catch It or Run, the show where I take an in-depth examination into Pokemon fan games and ROM hacks and give you the lowdown on whether the game is worth playing or skipping out on. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a game that had one of the longest development cycles for any game, fan-made or otherwise, that I have seen in my time with the Pokemon franchise. Today, the subject of study will be a legendary game simply known as Pokémon Reborn, and it is a game truly unlike anything I have ever played before among any ROM hacks or fan games in general.
Pokémon Reborn originally caught my attention quite a few years ago while it was still being actively developed, and that time was quite extensive, as Pokémon Reborn officially started development in 2012 and did not finish until 2022, a 10-year cycle that saw many faces come and go over the years. Compared to a lot of the fan projects and games I have encountered over the years, Pokémon Reborn has a unique dynamic to it that focuses a great deal of challenge upon those that get into it, with an impressive, complex, character-driven story that connects the player with a multitude of characters as events play out throughout the game. It's noted for many things, its difficulty and extensive world building being chief among them, and as a whole, it is one of the most unique games I have ever played within the fan community, and luckily, I had the privilege to be able to sit down with one of the main developers of the game, Amethyst, and speak to her on the development of the game and how it all came to be. Once again, thank you Amethyst for coming down with this interview. Just have a few questions I really want to ask to learn more about Reborn and how it all came to be and what really makes it the special experience that it really is. So, you've explained as much on your own commentated playthroughs of the game, but if it's not too much trouble, could you give us a brief explanation of how Reborn came to be, in terms of both where it came from and how it came to be as it is now?
Yeah, so technically the story starts back when I was a teenager. I used to frequent a lot of RPG Maker communities. Even as a kid, game development was like my main interest and hobby, ever since I was 10. And in one of those RPG Maker communities, as I just talked about on my stream this last weekend, I met a friend. He became my best friend, and after a while, we got to playing Pokemon together. We would do things like play Emerald, and try and match each other's steps, even though, we were just talking over the phone and in completely different states. But we were always talking about how it would be cool if we could fight gym leaders with the, skill and caliber as if we were fighting a real person. So after a while, I started, once, and not just after, it must have been once Gen 4 came out, that I made a sub-forum of my current website at the time to collect all my friends who played Pokemon, and that was the first incarnation of Reborn, the website, although it wasn't called that at the time yet. And I started making a league as a challenge to my best friend at the time, where I would create a team for each type, and we could do quote unquote gym leader battles over the Diamond Pearl Wi-Fi. He never actually ended up accepting that challenge, and part of that was on me for not finishing all the teams, but I did at the time create a list of character names based on types, badge names, and badge sprites, which are the same sprites edited which appear in the game today. That friend and I had a falling out, and that project fell by the wayside for a couple years, until I brought it back on a whim, and decided, if he never wanted to take the challenge, I would just offer the challenge to some other friends instead. And that became a league among a friend site of ours. And then when that actually started gaining traction between my friends, that transitioned into being an online league of its own. That was called the Reborn League, after the site that we had that, we were a bunch of high school kids playing Pokemon, so during the summer we were super active, and then during the school year, we'd all get busy with school and the site would die. And then it would get super active again the next summer, which is why we started calling it Reborn, because it would die and then be reborn with the school year. So that evolved from our friend group into an online league on Pokemon Online, where I wasn't expecting a bunch of, random people to stroll into the server and be like, hey, what's this cool gym league you got there? I want to try this challenge. But they sure did, and so the community grew quite rapidly from that point. And after a couple years, there were things like, if the Reborn League as an online challenge were a game region, what would it look like? And some of the community members contributed ideas to that, like the presence of Team Meteor. And I eventually decided, just for fun, no intention of making a game from it, to draw a map, which is the same map file that is included with the game download. On the website, there's also a poster of it. But it was a super detailed hand-drawn map, and I finished it after like 2 years of just kind of working on it on and off whenever I felt like it. And I kind of wrote out ideas of like, okay, if this were a game, which I'm not going to make it one, what might some of these areas be like? And then, a couple weeks after I finished the map, somebody else in the community was like, okay, guys, let's make a game based on this map and the league. And they happened to mention that they were going to use the same engine that Pokémon Raptor used, which I was very surprised to learn was RPG Maker XP. And I'm like, wait, hold on, this has all gone full circle right now. I happened to just have a bunch of experience with RPG Maker from when I was younger. I had I had abandoned making games when that friend and I had a falling out. But it's like, okay, wait, hold on. I already am deeply familiar with the program that you're planning to use. Let me just take a look at this real quick. I don't mean to steal your thunder, but I'm just gonna take a look at this whole project idea you've got there. And so I kind of whirlwinded it together and put out episode 1 2 weeks later. I don't think I did anything else during those 2 weeks. And I fully expected that I would get bored and drop the project after, I don't know, a couple months. I dropped a lot of the other games I worked on when I was younger. But I didn't. I stuck with it in part because of the overwhelming support and love from the community, and then people from the community started sharing it outside the community, and it grew from there, and, it got to the point where I'm very proud to say that because of all the support from the community and on my Patreon, I was able to work on it full-time and finally eventually finish it and put a lot of work into the quality aspect of it.
Amethyst was able to offer further commentary from there on the long development cycle of the game and all those that came and went on the development team, and in turn, how hard the game was to develop over time.
Now, was the development of this game easier a challenge for you and those that assisted you with creating it? Because I noticed there is a bit of a memorial somewhere in the game to those who, quote-unquote, left the development team, so could you explain what is really meant by that?
So the memorial is not, I put them in as gravestones partly because I didn't want to go making a custom sprite for another 6 people. I was already very tired. Or was it 6 or 8? I don't even remember. But, that was just to still credit and recognize people who had worked on the dev team in the past, and for various reasons, we went our separate ways. A lot of those times it's just, this has been a 10-year project. I don't expect any sane person to stick with me that entire time. People, some of the people who have helped out have done genuinely great work, and then it comes to a point where they're like, I need to move on. And it's like, yeah, that's totally understandable. So, I still want to appreciate them. So that's that graveyard room. The bit about it being memorial is not serious. They're not actually dead or anything. But as far as development being a challenge, so on one hand, because I've been working with RPG Maker for so long, and that includes spriting, granted not always at a quality that I would still have been proud of, but like the actual development part of the game hasn't been too hard. However, there's that meme that goes around sometimes that's, it's breaking up video game development as a string, and the first 10% is, wow, this is so fun, and then the next 80% of the length of the string is, oh my god, what the fuck, how does any video game ever get made? Developing any kind of long-term project is not easy. And I'd say for me, managing the team and managing my personal time has been a lot harder than the actual specific workload itself. And then there's, of course, rising standards. I want to continue to push myself to sprite better, write better, map better, all those fun things. So that's, learning and improving on those things isn't exactly easy either. But, it's a lot of work, it's stressful, and there's a reason that not many projects last that long.
As far as the plot goes for the game, it starts out simple enough, as you are a passenger on a train ride traveling to the Reborn region for reasons that are not fully explained, but at least initially have much to do with simply challenging the Reborn League, much as any journey would start off in a Pokemon game. However, it doesn't take too long for things to take a hard swerve elsewhere, as you, the player, end up caught in the middle of what is honestly a very active and dynamic plot to help investigate and stop the evil plans of Team Meteor and assist those that come across your path and in the way, or even on the side of, this villainous organization. And throughout your journey, you will end up meeting a very large cast of characters that will help to enhance and give greater depth to what you are doing, who is really pulling the strings behind the many events and atrocities that unfold over the course of the game, and in turn bring you into a world that is on the brink of collapse, only for you to have to be the one to put in the effort to help bring everything back to a happier and more pristine state than the world started in.
In saying all of that, it is also incredibly important that I make mention that one of the standout attributes of this game is the massive diverse roster of different characters that you encounter on your journey, and I asked Amethyst as to where many of these characters came from.
The game has a very wide, and I want to use this term very specifically, unique array of characters to it, and I'm honestly curious, what was the thought processes that went into creating all of them?
So originally the characters were not made with very much thought for the online league at that point. My goal was to make characters with distinct enough personalities that they could be fully understood within the 5 lines that would automatically play in their 15-minute battle. So for the online league, every character had a stock set of quotes based on the in-game messages that Black and White show with their characters. So we made quotes like that for every leader, many of which were at least represented or referenced in the game, if not put in there directly. So my original goal was to make characters that were simple and clear, and there wasn't any kind of intentional depth to them, because the expectation was a challenger on the online league was going to have a 15-minute battle with them and then never have to directly interact with them again. That started changing when some of the players in the online league took an active interest in the characters and started private messaging them on the side of battles. And so I had to, when I was playing every leader myself at the time, I had to improvise and go along with that. And so over time, I started making more and more character choices for the sake of keeping myself interested as somebody who was playing each of these characters. And although my friends, when I first started the online league, knew that I was just playing characters, the random people who wandered into the server and were interested in the league did not know that. So suddenly I was maintaining this facade. So when I was playing these characters and trying to be somewhat convincing about it for the sake of these new people's enjoyment, I'm also trying to keep myself sane. So, we started having some inter-character drama just because I'm bored over here. I don't want to keep saying the same thing and have a character that goes nowhere. And I feel like I kind of lucked into a better approach for characters with Titania and Amaria specifically. I talked this last weekend on stream a lot about how those two are closely tied to the relationship between me and the friend for whom I originally made the League Challenge that became Reborn. But those two represent the first characters where I started really putting as much of myself and my emotions into them as I could in personal experience. And I've come to find that aside from that just being personally gratifying, it's also a much better approach to make characters with real, relatable emotional flaws that actually resonate with people. You know, even it seems like just about everybody has a strong opinion about Titania and Amaria one way or another. You know, some people hate one and love the other, some people hate them both. And to me, that's all been fascinating to see, and has really informed my future character writing. Especially, I think that is probably going to be more visible within E19 and post-game, probably post-game, especially with the quests there that do have emotional content, where you can see how I am trying to put more of myself into every character. But that's also, to be fair, mostly the writing rather than the creation. The creation was very flat, and ever since then I've just been trying to do my best with it.
And that's totally understandable. And that's something about the post-game that I really like, is that, because to anyone who does play this, Reborn has a lot of characters in it, both major and minor, an absolute ton compared to any other traditional game. But I love the post-game because with a lot of them, you really get to see some unique character arcs take place, you know, that really help to bring that greater depth to these characters, make them much more intriguing and much more worthwhile to invest your time and understanding, and it really does pay off in almost every respect.
I'm glad to hear that that's landed. That was another case of, you know, I have to make all these quests for these legendaries anyway. I need to inject some of this, like, character therapy just to keep myself sane making these quests.
To anyone that really puts the time into the game to learn all about the characters in play, I have to remark that it is honestly one of Reborn's strongest assets. While I did have the advantage of having played the game before in early iterations than the final version, and thus had the chance to really interact with and develop a connection with many of these characters, even those on a first playthrough likely will have little trouble getting invested in a lot of them, as they mostly hit home not just as characters, but as people that can be related to. Reborn does not hold back when it comes to diving into the depths of these characters in both their personal lives and how they interact with others, and honestly everyone, from the minor characters that come and go throughout the story to the villains, gym leaders, Elite Four, champion, and so on, are built with such depth and personality that you can often find at least one character you can resonate with emotionally, and then have the chance to follow their pathways throughout the adventure, whether their ending be pleasant or not so much.
Building on to this, separate from the plot, the way that the story unfolds in the game is something that honestly struck me even in earlier iterations, and it shows a much more complex narrative than one might expect for a Pokemon game of any sort, which I also asked Amethyst about.
And on that note, compared to a lot of other fan games that I've played, I have to say that Reborn's story as a whole is a lot more complex and fleshed out than what I'm honestly used to. So, how exactly did that all come about? Why did you decide to go with such a complex narrative for it all?
Having a narrative that was complex was not my goal, but where I started making this game as a game based on the events of the online league, it felt appropriate to include as base material some of the drama and more notable developments that happened between characters in the online league, which, as I said just a minute ago, a lot of that drama was just me trying to keep myself interested. So, and I can't stress this enough, a lot of those were just improvisation and spur-of-the-moment decisions. For instance, the part of the game where Luna is kidnapped is based on a thing that happened in the online league, where Luna disappeared for I don't remember how long, which ultimately was because I just wasn't feeling up to playing her that night. So I made this whole subplot between Radamus and Elias with her as a result of I couldn't that night. It was a whole part-time job, and, you know, playing a character like Terra while also stressed out because of overwork and crying was not a fun experience, so sometimes I just gave myself a break that way. Just have a character dramatically storm out of the chat room, rage quit. It was fun in an entertaining way, but because of that, a lot of the drama was not carefully crafted. I really have some, I wouldn't say regrets in that I wish I had done something differently because I understand why I made those choices. But speaking strictly from a writing standpoint, I I do not like the foundation that the story exists on. It's another case of I had all of this base material which was not carefully made. It was in fact, very much by its creation, quite uncareful. And here I am, I'm just trying to do my best to fit it all into something that could resemble a cohesive story. Canon, I do have some reservations. Like, canon stories they're like eating water as soup. The gym leaders don't matter for what are supposed to be dramatic difficulty spikes. The evil teams fizzle out before the end of the game. Gen 5 was definitely the best they did with that regard. But it's definitely the exception rather than the rule, which has always been super disappointing to me. And things like that just seemed like obvious points for improvement. And so when I was trying to fit all this together, it seemed to fit naturally that this would end up being more complex than canon. I'm pretty sure some 8-year-olds could write stories more complex than canon.
Even if the complex nature of the narrative for the game might not have been intentional from the beginning, I have to say that it is without a doubt the most unique and gripping experience that I have ever had with any fan game or ROM hack I have ever played, and it really struck a chord with me and helped me to keep going through the game. In fact, I can honestly say that in some cases, it might have been the only thing keeping me going through some sections of the game, something I will certainly talk about in time, but it simply was just that compelling to me. The characters and the events that unfold between them feel both real and incredibly intense in a lot of cases, with highs and lows of emotions across the spectrum of the human mind. So if you are someone that is generally into games that are really character-focused and character-driven, then Reborn's story is something you can certainly enjoy. I can guarantee that. I will remark, however, that the story does come off as extremely dark and even edgy to some at first, and many reviews from other channels have sort of made note of this, but as someone that has actually completed the entire game, main campaign, and post-game, I can say that there is a lot more brightness to the narrative in the post-game and the chance to really get to know those met in the main campaign even more, so it's worth getting through the main campaign to see it all play out. As for Amethyst's comment on the main canon games, in all fairness, I will note that I do think that the latest story in Scarlet and Violet is probably the best since Generation 5, and Amethyst did express that she likely will eventually get around to playing those games. Possibly. So I think that there is at least some hope on that note that there is potential for the main canon games to still give a narrative experience that is more complex than what most of us have come to be used to with the main series games.
The next thing I wanted to talk about is the music for the game, and while I think that the soundtrack is quite fitting for how it was utilized in the game, there was something shared in common with most of the tracks in the game that I brought up with Amethyst during our conversation.
Now, moving on from that, when it comes to music, and I love music, but I also noticed something very interesting about Reborn's music track, and that is, a lot of it comes from one individual, Glitch X City. I have to ask, why did you choose to use so much music from the library or audio tracks that were based off of stuff that's in the library? Because I'm a huge fan of the content, and I've actually talked with them multiple times before doing educational projects to ask if I could use their music, and they've always been so wonderful to talk to, so how did all this come about for Reborn?
So when I was thinking about what music to use in the beginning, originally my plan was to just compose the soundtrack myself, but I wasn't exactly skilled at composition at the time. So in the meantime, I was looking for something to use as a, placeholder soundtrack. I was originally going to use songs from the YouTube channel Poke Remix Studios, which I think most people are familiar with. But when I was looking through songs for that, I saw in the recommendations this other channel I'd never heard of called Glitch X City. She was much less popular at the time. And I gave her a listen. I'm like, wait, I kind of like this better and it's less popular. Let's go with the niche creator rather than the big popular creator. So I messaged her, asked permission. She was like, yeah, sure, go for it. I think that she didn't expect the game to become as big as it did, which is fair because I didn't expect the game to become as big as it did. But like after I'd done that and started including that in the game, firstly, I eased off of my plan of making a custom OST because I felt strongly that I could not outdo Glitch because she is such a talented creator. And then secondly, every other fan game and their mother started using Glitch as well, which is a little bit unfortunate for how overplayed some of those tracks get. But it was my choice after that point to stick with her solely as the main composer for the game, just for some semblance of cohesiveness in the soundtrack.
I have to give Amethyst a lot of respect in her choice to stick with her initial choice for a music track, especially in not trying her hand in outdoing Glitch X City in their work, as it could have come off as an imitation that might not have aged well, or otherwise could be looked down upon others, but that's sort of just the way it goes. Regardless, the music tracks in the game hit an appropriate stride in a lot of cases, from the battles that defined the early game, to the pulse-pounding excitement of taking on a gym leader, and even environmental music, not just in how it can define the feel of a location, but even transform in time as the game progresses and the city of Reborn begins to flourish once again.
Now let's get to more of the meat of the game, and by that, I mean the mechanics that separate Pokémon Reborn from the main series games. While it might play much like a traditional Pokémon game in the sense of its battle mechanics and overall gameplay, there are quite a few changes that have been made to it to make it a far more unique experience, something that I brought up with Amethyst in our conversation on the game.
Now, when putting the game together, you chose to keep a lot of the core mechanics of the main series, that we're all familiar with, but you also added a lot more to the game in and out of battle, with one example that I absolutely love, being the introduction of field effects, which can affect the way that moves, abilities, and other attributes actually work in a setting far beyond what the main series offers. What exactly spurred the creation of these sorts of additions, and how do you think they really impact the overall playstyle for the average player?
So, when we were waiting for Black and White to release in the US, there was a forum thread that asked what features people in our community were hoping that they would include in Gen 5. And this was when we didn't have a whole lot of information about it. And so my thought was, I thought it would be really interesting if they included terrains, in which I basically described the field effect system in that thread on the forum. And then that kind of spun off into its own thread, thinking about what sort of specific terrain effects might be. Some of them kind of halfway got in the game, but for the most part, I forgot about that for years. That was all also specifically with inspiration to the anime, because there are a lot of battles in the anime where Ash wins only by taking advantage of the terrain and some creative upset, which I always found those very satisfying. At least relatively within the anime. So then, let's see, it must have been around Radamus's episode, so episode 10. I was talking with a friend about, God, I'm kind of just disappointed that Game Freak hasn't adapted terrains more widely. I think that this would have been around, it must have been around the time that Gen 6 came out, because Electric, Grass, and Misty, that's the other one. Right, I make this game. Were the first terrains in it. And I'm like, gosh, I appreciate that they're making moves like this, but I kind of wish they did more with them, especially after the Pledge combination moves from Gen 5. It just feels like they're missing out on a whole lot of potential here. And somewhere in that conversation with my friend, I remembered, wait, hold on. I'm making a Pokemon game. Oh, I could do this. That's crazy. Can I do this? I don't know how to program. You think I can do this? My friend was like, yeah, of course you can do this. And my friend was helping me out at the time. That was one of our past developers, Dan, who was like, in a word, yeah, we can totally do this. I'll help you out with it. And he didn't help me out with it, but that was probably okay because I learned to program and implement it on its own. And there we go. It was just some random idea that I had that I hoped that they would have adopted themselves. As far as impacting overall playstyle for average players, I think that, it has been pretty in line with my goals for it. I was hoping that it would help boss fights stand out, both thematically and just in terms of giving them an extra oomph. I was hoping that some players might enjoy doing field-themed teams for specific types of runs, and I've seen that a few times. I was hoping that it would help players be more opportunistic, give a bit more variety to what moves they use and what Pokemon might be viable in different circumstances. I feel like that has all been pretty on point, and I've been happy to see that people have enjoyed the field system so much.
And this is just one of many changes that have been made to the game to make it stand out. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to talk more about the major changes that players might want to be aware of if they plan on tackling Reborn. The first, as we just discussed, has to do with the implementation of the field effects system, wherein the field can actually have an impact on the moves, abilities, items, and so on that might be a factor in any battle, and there are a lot of them in Reborn. These fields can often be a deciding factor and heavily shape how the outcome of any one fight goes along, and while they might not always be present as a factor at the very start of the game, once you get to the first gym, you will likely have your first encounter with them, and may or may not come to like them in turn. As such, these effects can potentially make or break a team depending on what sort of effects they might have, and in many cases can demand that players find a way to work around them, or even make use of them to even the playing field against a difficult opponent. Thankfully, there are items in-game that can give you the rundown on what sorts of effects that a given field effect might have in battle, so if you don't have the time to look them up online on the wiki for the game, there is an in-game source available to those that explore the region thoroughly that gives you a leg up on the competition and find a way to get around their tricky attributes. Second, there is the Pokédex to make note of, as the Pokédex for Pokémon Reborn only goes up to Generation 7, and that is mainly because that is when the initial plans for the game were being finalized for it for the last few years of development. While this means that favorites beyond that generation are not featured in the game, I don't find that to be a huge problem, since all the Pokémon from those 7 generations are included in one location or another. However, it is important that players understand that, while the entirety of that dex is available, a standout feature for the game is that all of the legendary Pokémon, from the weakest to the strongest, are only obtainable in the post-game. In other words, these creatures, often the most powerful Pokémon in the game in some instances, are totally inaccessible to players for much of their initial adventure through the game. As such, you really need to learn how to make do with what you can find otherwise, and be ready to rely on the power of basic Pokémon in order to get through the game.
Next, I'd like to talk just a bit about how shiny Pokémon are handled in this game.
It really wouldn't be a proper post-Gen 1 Pokémon game if shiny Pokémon were not available, but I would like to make it clear that Reborn handles shiny Pokémon just a tad differently compared to the main series games. For one thing, the chances of actually encountering shiny Pokémon are much higher than in the main series games, enough that it's quite likely that players just going through the motions with the game are likely to find a handful of them even if they're not actually hunting for them in the playthrough. Moreover, almost all of the shiny designs for all the Pokémon featured are different from what is seen in the main series games, so there is an extra incentive of sorts present for those that want to hunt them down to see what new shiny sprites have been given to all the featured Pokémon in Reborn, if you don't want to spoil yourself and look them up on the wiki at the very least. I really like this feature, and I think it was a fun inclusion to make things a bit more vibrant and unexpected in the game, and as a shiny hunter, it certainly made playing through the game entertaining and a lot more of a fun time sink in past iterations than I might like to admit.
The changes made to Reborn, the components of it from the main series games, even extends to the items that are present in-game, as not only have the attributes of certain items changed in the game, but new ones have been implemented in order to create a more unique experience for those playing through the game.
There are a lot of examples that I could pull for this bit, but I think the one that would make the most sense for me to speak on would have to be changes made to items like the EV-enhancing power items. Normally when these items are held by a Pokémon and they defeat an opponent, they not only get the normal EVs that they would get from defeating that particular species, but also 4 EV points in the stat of choice that particular power item is based on. In Reborn, on the other hand, holding it and defeating an opponent is guaranteed to give a huge amount of EVs in the stat of choice for the item, and nothing more, which makes it incredibly easy to EV train Pokémon without having to worry about closely monitoring what sorts of Pokémon they are defeating to gain those needed EV points. As far as new items go, the set that stands out the most to me is the presence of not 1, but 4 different catching charms that can be found by exploring the game, and these items work just as they do in future generations and making it easier to catch Pokémon. The fact that there are 4 of them though means that players to look around carefully are likely to find these items extremely useful, especially in the post-game, as they are all but necessary to make obtaining the legendary Pokémon in the post-game a manageable affair.
Speaking on EVs and IVs, I'd also like to take a moment to note that Reborn makes it extremely easy to actually track these factors by making a new status screen for each Pokémon that shows exactly what the IVs and EVs are in-game.
This is incredibly useful for EV training, since it can give you a clear look at what stats need to be adjusted and by how much when training them, and it is also incredibly helpful as far as picking and choosing the right Pokémon to work with in battle goes. As will be discussed further on in this review, there are a lot of Pokémon that you can only get one chance to obtain early on before they become wild encounters in some locations, and since the best Pokémon you can get often come as these sort of gift encounters, there is an optional but helpful incentive to potentially soft reset for a specimen that has really good IVs, and the system allows this to be a manageable affair. It isn't necessary, but it can help to build a powerful team early on, and given that these gift encounters can possibly have potent egg moves that can make them stand out and more useful than some might expect, it's worth it to use this new status screen to plan ahead and get the best Pokemon possible for the future of one's playthrough.
Now, I'm sure that a lot of players that are familiar with Generation 4 know that mining in the underground can be both quite exciting and a bit of a necessity in order to obtain some Pokemon and rare items in those games, and Reborn introduces something to that caliber in its own right.
At some point in the game, you can obtain a mining kit that you can use to mine special boulders that you might find in cavernous environments throughout your adventure, and these boulders will give you the chance to mine them for rare and useful items. Thankfully for most, there are no sphere items in this game, so every rock that you choose to crack open will provide you with items that have actual use in the game, from shards that can be traded with move tutors to give your Pokemon unique moves beyond the natural and artificial move pool, to evolutionary stones, fossils, and other special items beyond that. However, players should be aware that boulders normally can only be mined once before they become unusable, though obtaining blast powder later on in the main campaign can make it possible to mine a boulder twice before it vanishes. However, for the most part, once these boulders are completely demolished, they are gone forever. The majority of them will not regenerate, and given that items such as max revives can normally only be mined from the rocks, as they're not available to purchase anywhere in the game at any point and are very rare to find as items in the overworld, you might want to rely on saving and soft resetting on them if you really want to get the most bang for your buck, especially if you're having trouble getting through major battles without a way to fully heal knocked out Pokemon in the heat of battle.
Without spoiling too much, I would like to next talk about another mechanic that is both a part of Reborn's story and a gameplay attribute that will come up on quite a few occasions throughout one's playthrough, especially in the main campaign. Pulse.
This is short for what I typically call Pulse Mega Evolution, which is essentially an artificial process used by Team Meteor to enhance the powers and attributes of a Pokemon greatly, even if they do not have the capacity to undergo anything like Mega Evolution on their own normally. This process can grant these creatures a great deal of extra power, new moves, abilities, and base stats, and make them a terrible force to face in almost any situation. This can prove to make some of them more of the more interesting and difficult opponents to tackle in any fight, but there is serious trouble with them in the lore of the game, as these beasts are basically being horribly mutated as they are attached to the machines that force them into this state, and as a consequence, this process is actively hurting and even killing them while it is still active in most cases. This provides not only an extra incentive to defeat Team Meteor and stop the machines causing this entirely, but also an incentive to rescue the Pokemon inside of them, which are being horribly tortured and even mutilated by their presence. You will also come across opponent trainers later in the main campaign and post-game that make use of a weaker, albeit portable model of these devices called Post 2, that effectively gives any Pokemon attached to them a full 252 EVs in all of their stats at once. So even after many of the big pulse fights are over, these devices can make getting past opponent Pokemon a serious chore, and thus require even more strategy and planning to put down. Reborn further makes things interesting through the inclusion of a morality system in the game that, while not always affecting gameplay in an obvious manner, can change the course of story events and how they unfold. The typical yes and no sorts of questions that most are used to seeing in Pokemon games that really don't have much of an impact in the long-term events of the main series games do have a greater meaning in Reborn. Not only will the choices you make with dialogue choices between characters affect how they see and interpret you, and thus affect how the ending of the game plays out, but you can put yourself in a position where it can change the narrative of the story as it unfolds, especially in the post-game, and thus presents players with a way to directly impact the way their adventure unfolds and where the game's narrative takes them as they make progress. Though I won't specify how this comes about so as to not give spoilers here, these decisions can even add up to entirely change the way the end of the main campaign and noble portions of the post-game roll out, and thus can affect the different opponents that are faced in different runs. So it is important to make your decisions carefully in your adventure if you really want to see everything the game's narrative has to offer.
While Reborn is usually best experienced by players that have at least some sort of experience under their belt, but can otherwise still pose quite the challenge to a lot of players, there is thankfully a way to alter the game to a certain degree to meet players partially as far as the difficulty and gameplay tolerances.
Specifically, there is a special password system within the final version of the game that can allow you to input a number of specific passwords that can change the way the game plays and in turn how it can be engaged with by others. Players are afforded the chance to input one of these passwords at the very start of the game and can input even more by obtaining data chips throughout the game and using them on PCs in order to make the passwords functional. The effects of these chips vary widely, but they can be used to change what sort of start is accessible at the onset of one's adventure, make it easier or more difficult to play through the game in a variety of different manners, or just mess with the game to have an especially kooky adventure. While the system might not be needed for all players, the fact that data chips needed to input them can be acquired throughout the first half of the main campaign and later bought for a decent price, plus can be turned off at any time at a PC if they prove to be undesirable, helps to make it very easy for players to customize their experience and take it at the pace and entertainment value that they choose for their journey.
Now, I know that for a lot of veteran players of Reborn, there's still a bit of an elephant in the room regarding the game, so let's talk about the one aspect that I think highlights what is often most commented on with Reborn, and that's how difficult it is. And it is hard. I talked to Amethyst about this standout attribute of the game and asked how it came about and what aspects it touches in the gameplay, as she then went on to explain.
Anyone who is anyone is always asked either directly, indirectly, or is screamed into the void. But there's one aspect of Reborn that stands out more than anything. It's how difficult it is. Now, I know how this term is often overused, but I have to say, when I look at how the game is made, it to me is genuinely the true Dark Souls of Pokemon fan games, and I say that because it is hard, extremely hard in some cases, but fair. I mean, players have to deal with a lot in the game, but the game provides all the tools you need in order to progress. You just have to figure out how to use them. How exactly did you approach this sense of difficulty in the game, not just with, the major battles like gym leaders like you mentioned, but as a whole?
For one thing, there's a lot to be desired from the difficulty of canon again. Like, guys, come on, the gym leaders have 2 Pokemon, and the Elite Four doesn't even have 4 full teams, and just like, what are y'all doing? So some of those things, are no-brainers, right? In fact, one thing that struck me is that, at least in the early game, it is almost very challenging to make a leader that is not too hard. And that problem slowly reverses the later into game one gets, because the players have as many and more options compared to the leader. But as far as the fights themselves, so there's just giving them a full team, just make this even playing field for one thing. Secondly, we might be going past even playing field here, but the field effects give a boost usually to their home player. And then the other 2 big things I feel like are the distribution of Pokemon within the game, which, a lot of people will not be surprised when I say that all the trash mons are early and all the good mons are later, but it surprises me how few games actually do that. Like, not to throw Insurgents under the bus in particular, except for insofar as it being a popular example of a fan game that does not at all try to do that. Which surprises me, because it feels almost like that is the obvious play for difficulty. In my case, I do that less for difficulty and more for, I want to give players a reason to potentially use every Pokemon at some point. Like, if we put Rattata after, I don't know, Snorlax is available, no one is ever going to use Rattata. So it obviously has to go before then. The difficulty is almost a side effect at that point, and a lot of people think that I axe mons, as in push them later back into the game over development updates, because it makes the game too easy. And there are a couple cases of that where Pokemon that were too strong were just too early, like Excadrill most recently, for instance. But usually it is more so for the sake of team variety. That does play a role, though. The other thing is the level cap, which, I did say in the first place, the original conception of the league was to make the experience for my friend of fighting against gym leaders as real people, which then, went full circle, because we're then making that experience of fighting real people into a game that is not real people. Oh, and there's the AI. We'll just mention that we had to rework all of that to be a lot more in-depth. But so I said that I still wanted the game to be somewhat challenging, not ball-breakingly difficult, but just have some pushback. And that was in episode 1, and then some smart aleck came on the forum after episode 1 and was like, actually, Ame, I soloed the game with my level 29 Typhlosion, so where's the difficulty, Ame? And so I'm like, okay. Alright, yeah, obviously it's not going to be hard if you only use a single Pokemon and over-level it. Then that's just how this game works. So, problem solving, level caps. Level caps make a huge difference as far as forcing people to seek advantages that are not strictly numeric, because a lot of casual players, I think, if they lose a fight, their instinct is, okay, I just need to be higher level, as opposed to I need to do something different. And I think that is those caps have been a game changer for forcing people to really adapt their strategy as opposed to just unga bunga grind.
I can totally understand that. And it is funny you mentioned Insurgents. I've actually played through Insurgents, and I will say I love the game, but you do make a very good point regarding it, and especially with the usage of mods. When I play through the main series games, I do it for research and writing work and all that. I always do what I call a power play, which is basically, as you put it, just over-leveling your starter and just plowing through the game as fast as possible. Now, if you're just doing it to, to collect stuff, or for me to get to start shiny hunting as quickly as possible, that's not a bad thing. But if you really want a challenge, you do have to put some limitations on there. And like you put it very eloquently, the level cap is definitely one way to do it, and having them try as many different Pokemon as possible is another great one. And I will say this, I have never before been so grateful as to the awkward usability of Swalot in the early game. That was an experience. I mean, it gets yawn, it gets toxic, it can actually take a hit.
Exactly, and I love hearing about these Pokemon. The players of Reborn are like, I never would have given a second look to whatever if it weren't for this, and now I actually really like this Pokemon. I love that.
Oh yeah. I mean, Swalot isn't exactly that powerful, but it made me love Toxic Stalling so much.
Some people might argue that I've done a disservice in that aspect.
But I do like that you actively made that choice, because there's one thing I'll also say about Reborn. If you think you're gonna be able to finish the game with the team that you start with, oh brother, sister, you got another thing coming. I think by the time I finished the game, I had a roster of close to 18 team members that I could use for different challenges, because you will need to adapt your team over time, not just as new Pokemon become available, but to deal with the different challenges that you face across the game.
And I feel like that's great because, there's, especially as more gens come out, there's a lot of very cool Pokemon. It's fun to use different things, rather than just having one team that you stick with, and, that has its own appeal, but why not have a reason to try more and more stuff?
And I'm kind of glad that you took that approach, especially because I've played a lot of fan games, and it's nice to finally have an idea where you not only do you have to really need to focus on team building right out of the gate, but also need to keep in mind that as much as you might grow attached to some of these Pokemon, at some point or another, they're going to outlive their usefulness. Some will last longer than others. I was raising my Swallow to level 62 before I found a way to replace it with something else viable, which is insane for a Swalot. But it gets you engaged, not just in the game itself, but really in the idea of how do you really plan ahead. Because there are some Pokemon that you can get access to that you're only going to get access to once. So, soft resetting for getting one with good IVs and whatnot, and even nature, is pretty much mandatory for a lot of the best Pokemon.
Maybe. I mean, so there aren't any Pokemon that are actively missable unless you, refuse to catch the special event when they show up or whatever. But I do want to, say for people who haven't played this game and might be put off by the prospect of having the softer set for IVs, there is a password that we have that can just standardize all of your IVs to be perfect anyway, so you don't have to worry about that. And, for natures, there are tools and stuff to change natures in game. There are actually tools much later on to change IVs. So to some extent, planning ahead is true, but I also don't want people to feel obliged to that form of tedium unless it's something that they are interested in optimizing.
Yeah, and that's understandable, and I'm glad you mentioned that. That was something else that I really wanted to hear your full thoughts on, the password system, because I remember that did not exist prior to this finished version. Up through 1 through 18, that system really wasn't in play, and I have to say, Reborn itself can be difficult, but the password system is honestly wonderful because A, if you need a little bit of extra help, like you said, there are plenty of passwords that can help make the game easier or otherwise make it more interesting. And on the other hand, it's also totally optional. So if players do want to brutalize their mind and try and get through the game without them, that's also an option. I think having that choice really makes Reborn a lot more, how do I put this, accessible nowadays than it was in prior versions.
Definitely, especially with a lot of the QOL passwords. And, you know, it was mainly for replayability, so we could get alternate modes like randomizer and Nuzlocke in there, in such a way that it wouldn't be overwhelming to first-time players. And that was the reason I wanted to go with a password-esque system. And then you can also just, you know, the same tools that make it easier can just be inverted to make it harder as well, so there's a lot of customizability.
Lastly, in this review, and talking about Reborn specifically, I want to make a statement regarding the overall longevity of the game. From my own personal experience, Reborn is not a game that you can just get through in a few days or even a week. No, the main campaign of the game and the post-game combined took me over 120 hours of in-game time to complete, and that's both not counting restarts and how many attempts it took me to complete and get past certain objectives and battles, and accounting for the fact that I used the online wiki and other sources for a lot of help getting me through events and puzzles for much of the game. Granted, I also went for a total dex completion and managed to do just that, but my point is still here. And for Reborn's case, I honestly think that the extreme length of the game is more than justified as a result of the game's scope of characters and the need for that length to give a full and complete story to not just the overall narrative, but the many character arcs that take place throughout the game. In a word, this game is dense. Tightly packed with a huge map to explore, and plenty of other worlds hidden within it that work to make the game at least twice as large as it may seem at the very onset of your journey. As a result, I have to remark that if you just want something that is hard but can otherwise be completed in a reasonable amount of time, then you might be in for quite the surprise with Reborn, and I'm happy that it is as it is. It gives you that much more time to really get to know everything and every place that is a part in the game, and while it might seem a bit daunting to many at first, the effort that one puts into everything can still matter a great deal, and slowly but surely, for those that are willing to put in the time, the results can be more than worth it at the end of the journey.
To start to wrap this up, I want to know from Amethyst's perspective how creating the game has changed the outlook on not just fan games, but also the Pokémon franchise as a whole, as I figured that the creation of a game as unique and massive as Reborn must have had an impact on her and the way that she now sees the franchise.
Now, with all that has been done with Reborn and its development, do you think it really has changed the way you look and approach fan games and even the Pokémon franchise as a whole?
So for fan games, yeah, I feel like I have less respect for the games themselves, but more respect for the creators because I understand how difficult it is to make them. With the games themselves, you know, it's like sometimes I'm still in a mood to play a Pokemon game, and a lot of the times I, you know, look at my options. ROM hacks aren't appealing anymore. You know, there's some difficulty hacks I've enjoyed, like Blaze Black, which was how I played Black a few months ago. Rejuvenation and Desolation are both obviously enjoyable, but sometimes I'm just like, you know, of all the games that are out there that I'm aware of, I think I'd rather just play my own. So I enjoy that. It's kind of made me want for things less, which is probably good, given that I tried to make this the kind of game that I would want to play as a player. But it also means that with projects that are less well developed, I'm always, and this is true for this is true not just for fan games, but for video games as a whole. I'm always looking at, you know, I really would have made a different choice here. This really needs a QOL on the UI. They're really missing some potential in the character development here. It's kind of a little bit unhealthy if I'm being honest. I'm trying to work on that and appreciate games for what they are more now. And I can be pretty critical about that because I'm always trying to improve my own work, so I'm looking for those flaws. But you know, it's a work in progress. I still like fan games as a concept and video games a lot, obviously. For Pokemon itself, I am a little bit tired of it, of canon specifically. I haven't touched Scarlet and Violet, but that's just because in the vein of there being, I would really be making some different decisions here. There's, it's been like 4 generations of me hoping that Game Freak would make some different choices than they have. Gen 5 was great, and since then it's kind of just been downhill. Gen 7 wasn't so bad. Gen 8, I was really on the side of Game Freak, when there was all that hoopla about Dexit. And my opinion was, hey, guys, they are a huge corporation that is short on talent and really trying their best. Gen 7 was a step up from Gen 6. Let's wait until the game comes out before we make some judgments. The game came out, I played it, and just the pain. I did not enjoy Sword and Shield whatsoever. So I have kind of just stepped away from it at this point. I feel like really, like when they announce a cool new Pokemon, even for Gen 7, when they announced Lycanroc, I had wanted a wolf Pokemon forever. I did use it in, did I use it? I think I did. I assume I used it in my playthrough. But I'm really just sitting there like, I'm gonna enjoy implementing and using these Pokemon in Reborn a lot more than I will trying to play through the canon and enjoy them there.
And lastly, I asked Amethyst if she had any bits of advice for those that wish to get into playing Reborn.
I just have to say, if there's anything more that you'd like to say to Reborn, I'm curious, is there something that, for those who are considering playing the game or, are interested in it, what would you say is the best piece of advice you would give them in having a fun, entertaining time with the game?
I would say just go in expecting to use a lot more Pokemon. Go in expecting to treat it as almost its own sort of puzzle. Because a lot of people play through Pokemon games like you establish your 6 Pokemon team and then, you fight, you grind, and that's it. But I really enjoy this game the most when it is a matter of solving the difficult fights, piece by piece, and it just so happens that your pieces are cute and cool little critters. There's a lot of places where you will be rewarded for exploring with new Pokemon or items, a lot of puzzles that have Pokemon or items as rewards, and then those pieces themselves can help you solve the puzzles of the battle. And I feel like that's the best way to approach the game in and of itself, as opposed to just, Unga Bunga number stat check. Super effective. Don't just click the super effective move. You gotta understand. You gotta understand the rules and play the game.
In concluding my review of Pokémon Reborn, I want to make it very clear that this game was a serious challenge for me, and there were many points where I felt like I couldn't actually get through it all for this review. But I chose to keep going and persevere through it all for the sake of making this review as thorough and complete as I possibly could, and I am very glad that I chose to do so. For many, Pokémon Reborn will likely come off as something that is incredibly dark and difficult, maybe even edgy to some, but I think that the game and the adventure that's within it are only like that for those that aren't able to get into the game properly for the long run. The evolution of the story and narrative as it unfolds leaves much for players to sink their teeth into and can provide an adventure whose scope, both in the story and overall gameplay, is both familiar enough for any fan to jump in, and yet unique enough for the game to be more than just a game. It is an experience, and one that is beyond worth it in my eyes for those that are looking for a game that can fulfill the narrative and difficulty needs of many others that the main series might otherwise lack in the eyes of some. I firmly believe that this game is one that everyone should check out if they can invest the time and effort that will be needed to get through it all and make the most of the experience.
So, if you're someone that doesn't have a lot of time and patience to make the most of Reborn and enrich yourself in its narrative, the many characters within it, and the challenging nature of the game, then it might not exactly be for you. But if you're a veteran looking for something to really invest your time seriously into, or a casual player that just wants to really embed themselves in the story that very much shows that actions have consequences that can help to drive the story into unique avenues that make it one of the most fulfilling experiences a fan game has ever delivered, then you will resonate with me when I ask whether we should catch it or run. Catch it! With that said, I thank you all for sitting down for this review, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for watching this video. It brings me great joy to be able to speak to you all in the world each and every time we meet like this, to explore the many different facets of both the world of Pokemon as we know it, and the world as we live it, through every adventure we have with Pokemon by our side. If you'd like to, please subscribe, ring the bell and all that jazz, to keep yourself updated on content uploads and other materials of the like. You can also follow me on Twitter if you'd like to know right away when something new is uploaded, and my written works, from which most of this is based on, can be found on DeviantArt. Links to both can be found in the description down below. Remember that the world of Pokemon is a place full of wonder and mystery, and you never know what to expect. So, stay vigilant, keep watch, and always be prepared for the unexpected. Until next time, trainers and friends of all sorts, have a wonderful time.